listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Welcome to another edition of the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. I'm your host, Femi Abebefe. As always, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. And wow, we got the big contract everyone has been waiting for. Justin Jefferson, all-pro wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings, signing a 4-year extension worth $140 million, $110 million guaranteed, $88.7 million fully guaranteed, Michael, as he resets the wide receiver market.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what this comes out, what the real numbers are. Obviously, WME did it. I think Todd France was involved with it as well. He works there too, but it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out, right? Because, we knew he was going to get the big deal. I think everybody was waiting on it. Certainly CD Lamb was waiting on it. I don't know if Brendan Ayuk can make the case that he belongs in this market, but I do think that, when you look at some of Chase certainly thinks he's going to be in this market and he deserves to be. I couldn't argue with that, right? And then, Tyreek Hill's sitting there, and I'm sure Drew Rosenhaus has called and said, hey, you need my guy. You need my guy more than anybody, because if you want to give your quarterback all this money and you don't have my guy, good luck. So it's going to be, there's always the ripple effect. And this is what makes it so good that, this keeps going, the ripple effect of how it all parlays itself. Hill's at 30 million. St. Brown's at slightly above 30. AJ went to 32, and I think this comes out to 35 per year, which is the highest for any non-quarterback in the league, which to me makes no sense at all. I'd rather put my money in defensive linemen that can rush the passer, offensive linemen that can block the pass, the rushers, defensive linemen, 3 techniques, all that. But the NFL's trend is to pay these receivers. And what happens here, Femi, is the difference between what good is great. Jefferson, great. Tyreek Hill, great. And when you look at their numbers, Jefferson averages 15 yards a catch. He gets the ball into the end zone. Those are important factors. Whereas if you're just accumulating catches, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what because this has sort of been the offseason of the wide receiver. Last year, it was the offseason of the running backs. We had the Zoom calls and all that. The receivers clearly don't have to fight for their money like that. They're going ahead and getting paid from all their teams. But I thought it was interesting. You brought up these receivers getting paid. I know Field Yates over at ESPN tweeted that 5 of the 8 highest paid non-quarterbacks are wide receivers now, which, we've discussed the wide receiver position and its value here. And you've always talked about how Bill Walsh said that's the last piece of team building is the wide receiver. The league, they love paying these guys, and they are playmakers. Justin Jefferson is a phenomenal football player, but I'm like you. I'm paying quarterbacks, and I'm paying offensive linemen, and I'm paying defensive linemen, because those are the guys who are closest to the football, and those are the guys, in my opinion, are the most impactful when it comes to winning football games.
Well, I think Minnesota made the decision. Look, if they could have traded Jefferson for Neighbors and other things, I'm sure they would have done that, right? But they couldn't do that. And you can't trade Jefferson for an unknown quantity. You could say, well, trade him for a first-round pick. Well, you don't know what you're getting back, right? You could hurt your team. You have to know what you're getting in order to make a trade. So once they couldn't get to 4 or 5, like it was reported, there's no way they could make that deal. But I do think that what's happening is water seeking its level. And so the good players are getting closer to the elite players. Like Tyreek Hill's elite, right?
Yeah.
Waddle, 80% of their offense goes through those 2 guys. Are those 2 guys making Tua, or is Tua making them? I'd like to think they're making Tua. So if you pay Tua 55 and you're paying Hill 30 and you're paying Waddle 28, where's the money left for anybody else? It's not 7-on-7. We got to block somebody. We got to tackle people. It's like when you start paying these guys that are not number ones is really when you get into trouble, and you've got to have the tolerance to say, no, I'm not doing that. Jefferson, because they drafted the quarterback, because they've shifted their cap around and they've got a young quarterback, they feel like they could pay him. But San Francisco's got Samuel. He's making $23 million. Ayuk's going to make 30. They're going to have to do something with one of those players. It's the same thing with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. You can pay Jamar Chase the same numbers, but are you going to be able to afford Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow at these huge deals? mean, that's really hard to do, right? That's really hard to do. And then all of a sudden you have no depth and you can't function as a football team. Even and although everybody in the world, they all love, in the analytical community and all that, this generation that could care less about offensive and defensive line. And yet the team that wins a Super Bowl, gave up the player to do this. They've won 2 Super Bowls without Tyreek Hill.
Yeah. And I guess people would say, well, they have Patrick Mahomes and they have the best quarterback in the league. But still, I think the process is what is sound from Kansas City of saying, hey, we're going to build the defense with our really good quarterback because our really good quarterback who we paid can elevate the guys around him, which is kind of goes back to the Miami situation of, is it Tua or is it these receivers that are making Tua look like how he looks right now?
That's the one right there. That's the one. Because if you're paying Hill and Waddle, and you're saying to Tua, I'm going to pay you over 50. If Hill doesn't play and Waddle, I mean, where are we going? Like at some point, somebody has to make the decision of who's making the player. Buffalo's already done this. Buffalo said, look, we'll put a bunch of young receivers around Josh Allen and he'll make them better. It's the same thing Kansas City decided. They said the same thing. We'll put young receivers around Patrick. We'll make them better. We'll pay. We've got one legitimate superstar in Travis Kelce. We're going to pay him, but we're moving on. We're going to take care of these lines, and we're going to move forward. We won a Super Bowl with our defensive line, with Chris Jones in our front. But now all of a sudden you got all this money going into the other directions. But you can't overpay for great. You can only overpay for good, and that's what I think we're going to see. Is because when you start to overpay for good, it takes away from other players.
I was making a list before we started recording of who the biggest winners are of this Justin Jefferson deal. Obviously, Jefferson and his family and his agent are the clear number one winners for me. And congratulations to Justin Jefferson for getting that contract. JJ McCarthy and Sam Darnold, big winners in my opinion, having your elite wide receiver stay on this roster and not a future first round pick who we don't know who that player would be. Also, I mean, we talked about CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, maybe Brandon Ayuk. Those are big winners. Of those 3 guys, especially for Lamb, that one feels like it might be a little bit closer, but of course the Cowboys have to figure out what they're going to do with Dak Prescott. Do you think Lamb is the next guy of that trio to get paid? Because Lamb is the guy that was first team All-Pro this season amongst all of these guys who are getting paid.
Look, how are you going to pay Lamb this number? How are you going to pay Dak a big number? And how are you going to pay Parsons? Like the big winner here is Parsons. The big winner is Parsons. Because Parsons is going to say, look, man, I'm better than Jefferson. I change games. They game plan against me. I sack the quarterback. Right, I'm Lawrence Taylor of this generation. Okay, now I know he's not Lawrence Taylor, but I'm just saying that's the argument. So I got it. Like he's the big winner here, right? Because Jefferson just blew past Nick Bosa. How are you going to pay them all? How are you going to pay them all? And Hill's a winner here. I just don't know how you pay Lamb, Prescott, and Parsons. How do you pay all 3? If you're paying all 3 over, you're paying 2 guys. Let's say they pay both the 2 receivers 30. That's $70 million, and you pay the quarterback $60 million. That's $130 million. Where are you getting the rest of your team?
Yeah, you got to make some hard decisions.
They've already made them. That's why Jerry said he was all in. But you got to draft really well, and you have to be proactive. You can't overpay, and you have to cut guys. You can't overpay for Michael Gallup. You can't overpay for Dalton Schultz. You got to figure out, hey, that guy's a replaceable part. That guy's not. We can get something here. I mean, when you look at all these receivers getting paid, it's like, whoa. I mean, Houston just paid Nico Collins after they paid Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs is going to be the 3rd receiver on their team. Tank Dell is the slot. Nico is going to get the money. And so you're paying for a 3rd receiver. You're paying over $20 million on a 1-year deal. That's a lot, man.
And maybe Houston feels that they can do that since C.J. Stroud is still on his rookie contract. We saw Minnesota make the tough decision of saying, all right, we're breaking free from Kirk Cousins' jail because we want to pay Justin Jefferson, but we can't do both. We want Jefferson. We don't want Cousins because we've been down that road. Would Dallas ever do something similar? Jerry said they're all in, and they're all in on this trio of Dak, CeeDee Lamb, Micah Parsons. I just don't know how they're going to figure out the rest of it. Like you mentioned, like someone's going to have to get left out of this trio. And speaking as a fan, it better not be Micah Parsons just because of how young he is and how great he is. It can never be Parsons. You got to kind of decide between Dak and Lamb, and it sounds like they want both guys. I just don't see how you get that done. Like you mentioned, not everybody can get a big plate of rigatoni. Someone's got to get short.
Not everybody can eat it all, right? I mean, I think at some point, you got to share. Since I really think, to me, if the guy who's vulnerable, I know this sounds crazy, is Dak, because if they could find somebody who they feel like can play adequate at quarterback and relieve them, then they could, because Dak's going to want, even though Dak says he's not interested in money, he is. And he deserves to get paid because, these quarterbacks are getting, it's like Tua. I mean, Tua's sitting there saying, I got to get $55 million. Are you sure you're going to pay him that? Are you going to feel good about that? I mean, I think Tua is helped by these receivers. There's no question. And by the scheme. And, they're all in on it. And Tua's argument is clear. Look, Justin Herbert got 52.5. How could I not get that? It's hard to be in a negotiation and say, well, the reason you're so good is Tyreek Hill's great.
Mm-hmm. Real quick before we wrap here, Brandon Ayuk, you don't think he gets close to this or anything like that? He's not really in. Is he more in the Waddle camp or is he more in this camp?
I think he's more in the Waddle camp. I mean, he had that one elite year. Last year he averaged 17 yards a catch. To me, the guy that's vulnerable here is Samuel, because Samuel's a unique player. He's really good. But Kyle does such a good job of getting him the ball. But on third down, the ball's going somewhere else because he's got to win one-on-one routes. Samuel's a running back who's an elite receiver when the ball's in his hands.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. I mean, the mini camps are getting underway. Vikings are at mini camp this week. Dallas Cowboys, San Francisco 49ers. Now it's mandatory for guys to show up. We're no longer in the OTA phase for a select group of teams. Now this is the mini camp phase before we get to training camp. And the ripple effects of this Justin Jefferson deal will be felt throughout the course of this NFL offseason. We obviously taped an interview, which we will play for you guys after the break here with ESPN NFL and college football analyst Booger McFarland. That will be the remainder of this podcast. But we wanted to jump on here Monday morning with the breaking news: Justin Jefferson resetting the wide receiver market and the ripple effects for the rest of this offseason. I can't wait to see how it all unfolds with these big name wide receivers getting paid. Michael, I will see you later this week on Thursday. Make sure you tune in. The rest of the podcast, Booger McFarland interview coming up next here on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Michael, this is a fun treat for us. We're continuing our series of having cool people on that talk about the sport that we know and love. And we're welcoming on the GM Shuffle podcast, the one and only Booger McFarland, ESPN, NFL and college football analyst. Of course, played many, many years in the NFL. You can find him on Twitter at ESPN Booger. Booger, how we doing, man? Thanks for hopping on with the pod. This is a real treat for us.
Hey, man, the pleasure is all mine. I'm doing outstanding. It's 100 degrees and sunshine, and we still got no state taxes in Florida, so life is good, man.
Absolutely.
Life is good, Booger. That life is good. So now that you have time to kind of, you've done the draft, you've gone through the season, and you're sitting there thinking as you're on that golf course, like, what team do you think, you know what, they may be better than I first thought? Is there a team that kind of hits you that way?
Yeah, I would start with Chicago. And the reason I say that is because I think if Caleb Williams is as good as we think he is, sure, he's going to go through some struggles. Every rookie quarterback does. He's not going to be perfect. But I just think they have enough veteran presence around them. When you look at what they got with Keenan Allen, some of the pieces that they got in the draft, I know Matt Eberflus probably hasn't gotten the fairest of shakes in Chicago, and rightfully so, because he hasn't been good early on. That defense started to play really good toward the second half of last season. And I think if the offense can just be average, I think they're going to be better than a lot of people think they're going to be. Does that mean they're going to be a playoff team? Probably not. But they have an opportunity, I think, to get a few more wins, definitely more than they got with Justin Fields, just because I think this quarterback is a little bit better if they can get him to play on time throwing the football from the pocket.
They certainly addressed the wide receiver, getting Keenan Allen in a trade. They draft Rome Odunze out of Washington. DJ Moore was already there, so a lot of weapons for Caleb Williams to go ahead and use offensively this season. But one of the criticisms that we've had of the Bears this offseason is that they didn't really address defense. Like, they didn't get a guy like you, a three-tech. Where's the three technique on that Bears defensive line? Something that's been pretty valuable in this Matt Eberflus defense, something that they really need to kind of get this thing rolling along.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair criticism, and I think Flus, who I've been knowing him for a long time. Everybody calls him Flus. I think he's got a scheme that he feels really confident in, and I think when you look at what they've done in this draft, here's a name to keep in mind: the guy named Austin Booker out of Kansas. I think they're going to put him opposite of Montez Sweat, and I think from a standpoint they'll be able to rush the passer. Now, from a three technique standpoint, they're still missing that guy, and I think that's where the hole in the defense is ultimately going to be. But this defense is going to be fast. They're going to fly around. They don't have all the pieces. And when you're a team building, and Michael knows this, you're not going to address every problem in one offseason. That's why it's called team building. It's not just team makeup. You got to build your team. And usually it takes a couple of 3 years to build a team. Just look at Detroit. Like, Detroit didn't just show up and become Detroit last year. They built that team over a couple of years in Dan Campbell's eyes. And even this year they added to it. So I think this year was the first step for Chicago. You get the quarterback. You can build the defense. If you got your bookends and Austin Booker opposite Montez Sweat, now next year when you see where you go, then you got to add the three technique in there, and then I think they'll be well on their way.
You know, I do agree Chicago is going to be better. I agree with the sentiment you share, but I also think the North is going to be better. You mentioned Detroit. And Detroit, to me, you know, I know they've paid everybody and everybody's happy, but I don't get the sense that they're content. You know, like last year, I thought the Giants were happy and they paid everybody and it was going to affect their team. Do you get that sense with Detroit? I think Detroit still has that hunger to them. And, you know, look, they should have beaten Dallas in that one game. I mean, they got San Francisco. He goes for it on fourth down, which I didn't agree with in that game. But I just get the sense Detroit is going to take another step.
I completely agree, Mike. And think about this. What are the two organizations in pro football that we say that we give them the benefit of the doubt regardless of the players on the team? Baltimore and Pittsburgh. And why is that? It's because of the guys at the top, John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin, because it's play like a Raven. It's the Steeler way. It's how we're going to do things. It really doesn't matter who the players are. Now, yes, they need competent NFL players, but you know when you go in those buildings, you know the style of football you're going to get from those two teams based on the culture, based on the guys that are in charge. And it's very similar now, I think, in Detroit. Dan Campbell came out, and we all made fun of him at the opening press conference, talking about biting knees and elbows and knocking you down.
Yep.
But isn't that the way they play? Isn't that how they go about doing their business? Yep. And when you look at a guy like Aiden Hutchinson, he kind of fits Detroit. Like, he's a blue-collar guy. That's how they're going to play. They're going to be physical. Yeah, it's a passing league, so they have a quarterback who they paid a lot of money, and they're going to throw the football around. But at the end of the day, you know that they're going to run the football behind Penei Sewell. They're going to be physical. That offensive line is going to set the tone. And Dan Campbell has created a culture. It's about loyalty because he stuck by the defensive coordinator, Aaron Glenn. When everybody said fire the defensive coordinator, he didn't do that. He stuck by Aaron Glenn, and he's created a building of accountability, of physicality, of culture. And I think the players understand that when you walk in the door, regardless of where you come from or what your offseason was like, when you walk in our building, you know exactly how you're supposed to act and what you're supposed to do. So I agree. There will be no fat cat sentiment in Detroit.
Yeah, no, Detroit, they've taken on the persona of their head coach and Dan Campbell. And we thought the Green Bay Packers, who are always discussed here on the GM Shuffle podcast, thanks to our friend Big Daddy, like that's another really good team in that NFC North that I think is going to be tricky. I do want to pivot, Booger, back to the draft, though, because you cover college football, you cover the NFL, you've watched all these guys. Did you have a favorite defensive player in this past draft? Because the defenders were almost the afterthought. I mean, we went 16 picks or 15 picks before we saw a defensive player go in the first round. Who is your favorite defensive player in this draft and why?
I'll give you two. I'll give you a defensive tackle out of Texas, Byron Murphy Jr. He's not Aaron Donald. I don't even know if he's Grady Jarrett just yet. But as far as you're talking about a three technique, when we were discussing about Chicago, like he's what today's NFL is. He's 6'1.5". He's 290 pounds, and he's built like almost like a linebacker. Like the league has gotten smaller. I don't know, Mike. I know you studied the league a lot. Like one of my things that I've noticed is that in the last 10 years, the league has gotten smaller, meaning the players aren't as big. So when you look at a guy like a Byron Murphy, he may not be the biggest defensive tackle, but because the league is so much inside-outside zone, you can't cut on the backside. There aren't many double teams. I think he's going to be able to dominate early. So that's number one. And number two, from a cornerback standpoint, Enos Rakestraw out of Missouri. Very rarely do cornerbacks set the tone for their team. I was talking to the Missouri defensive coordinator, Blake Baker, who's now the DC at LSU, and he said, without a doubt, the person that set the tone for their defense was Enos Rakestraw, the cornerback. And when you tell me that, when you tell me a corner sets the tone for your entire football team, one or two things are true. Either your team is soft as hell or this corner has a lot of juice to it. And I'm going to choose the latter. And I think this guy has a lot of juice. And oh, by the way, where did he wind up going? To the Detroit Lions. Doesn't it kind of fit the mold that they drafted a guy that kind of fits what they do, that has that buzz? And so I love those two picks of Byron Murphy and Enos Rakestraw.
Yeah, and I do too. And I love the Murphy pick for Seattle. I mean, I don't understand how teams pass up three techniques. And I agree with you. I think the reality of it is we no longer are in downs. We are in formations. And if a defensive tackle can't play against 11, like when you were in Tampa or Sapp, you guys could play against any formation. But remember when Ted Washington and Keith Traylor were in Chicago? I'm dating myself here, but those two big guys played two. They were, when it became a passing down, you had to kind of get somebody else in there. But you can't do that any longer because every down's a passing down. And I think you need that athleticism. And look, every linebacker that you watch today is like he's covering a punt. Nobody fits on a run. Yeah. Everybody runs to the ball. It's like punt coverage. And so if you don't have that, I think it becomes a real issue. And I agree. I like both those players in the draft. I think Seattle finally got somebody who can rush from the inside, which I don't think we talk enough about is those inside rushers. But, I also, in the draft, where was your view? How did you end up with the quarterbacks? And I know we all have different opinions of them, and I could care less where they got drafted because it's going to matter how they play. From watching college, what was the one guy that you said, man, that guy's really good, and then you watched where he went in the draft? Besides Caleb, let's take him out of it.
Yeah, I like Drake May. I like the guy that has the God-given attributes, and I get it. The footwork needs to be cleaned up. I get it. He needs more experience. 23 wasn't as good as 22. I get all those things. But I'm always reminded of what Mike Tomlin said years ago when we were just talking about prospects and coaching. And he said, if these guys didn't need to be coached, I wouldn't have a job. So it doesn't bother me that a guy like Drake May needs coaching. It doesn't bother me that Drake May is not a finished product. Here's what I know. He's 6'3", 230 pounds, and he can throw the football. He comes from a football family. His brothers all played football. He eats, sleeps, and dreams about football. So the mentality that you need to play this game is there. He understands what the game is. Yeah, he is very raw, but it's the job of the coach, and Alex Van Pelt, who's the OC or quarterback coach up in New England, it's the job of the coach to coach him up. So he was one of my favorite guys in the draft, and I know he was kind of put down at quarterback 3 after Caleb and after Jaden Daniels. But if you were to tell me, hey, you could pick one of these guys and you could just kind of invest in his career and follow him along. I love Jaden because Jaden did wonders for LSU. I don't know if I want my quarterback running the football because eventually it's not if, it's when they're going to get hurt. I want my guy to be able to throw the football and distribute the ball. And I think Drake May, with the proper coaching, may wind up being the best quarterback in this draft.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of praise there for Drake May. But real quick on Jaden Daniels, as we're coming up against it on the break here. I know you're an LSU guy. I'm sure you watched his entire career at LSU and maybe even watched him at Arizona State as well. What kind of player are the Commanders getting with Jaden Daniels at 2?
They're getting a guy that's ascending. Think about where he was his freshman year at Arizona State to where he was the opening game at LSU against Florida State in the Superdome. And think about where he wound up winning the Heisman Trophy. The level of improvement that he made from game 1 to the end of the season was outstanding, and I think the arrow's going up. And he fits today's NFL where you need a guy that's a little mobile. He's a pocket passer, but he can also hurt you with his legs. So I love where he is.
Yeah, he's a playmaker for Dan Quinn and that Washington Commanders team. Can't wait to see how that unfolds in the NFC East with Jaden Daniels as the QB for the Commanders. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Booger's going to hang out with us on the other side as well. We're going to ask him about the pending proposal from the NFLPA. Are we going to see an offseason structural change in the NFL? We'll discuss that next year. This is the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
All right, we're rolling along here on the GM Shuffle with Booger McFarland, ESPN, NFL, and college football analyst. And it's interesting, just last week, as full disclosure, we're taping this on Thursday, May 30th, but so this week, a couple days ago, we saw the NFLPA. There's a potential proposal to change the structure of the offseason. OTAs typically going on right now in the springtime, potentially removing those to a virtual setting and then going to a longer ramp-up period later on in June and July to get ready for training camp. As a player, rookie or vet, how do you think that would affect the NFL offseason, and would you be in favor of that if you were in the league today?
Well, I would not be in favor of it. It sounds good because this player in this day and age, guys, they want to make a lot of money, but they don't want to work. Like, let's just call it what it is. If you go back to the last CBA negotiations, they actually traded away money for less padded practices and things of that nature, which for the veteran guy like myself that's been around this league a long time was kind of asinine. But as far as this proposal is concerned, think about this. And everybody says, well, football is the only sport that you have to come in the offseason and kind of interrupt it and then show back up at training camp. Well, here's the reason why. Football is different than baseball. It's different than basketball. In baseball, you can go take live BP and the ball can be thrown 99 miles an hour and you can hit live batting practice. In basketball, you can go play high-level pickup games all summer long and stay with your skill level sharpened. Football, you can't do that because you can't put the pads on. You can't put the helmet on. You can't call the plays. You can't line up and cover somebody one-on-one from a skill development. You can't be in a team setting in 11-on-11. So I understand the premise of what all these guys are saying. Hey, let's just show up in like July the 5th after the holiday, and let's start a ramp-up period that's going to go from July 5th to Labor Day. Now, let's play this out. How do we think that's going to go? From July the 5th until Labor Day, we're going to be in some form of training camp for 2 months? We're going to be in some form of, hey, show up to the facility every day for 2 months and let's lead up to it. I just think football is a different sport, and football is a different level of teamwork and skill development that you can't do it the way baseball and basketball does. So I think this will be a colossal mistake by the NFLPA. And I think we have to understand that in order to make more money, you have to have more skill. And in order to have more skill, you have to develop that skill. And that's done in low pressure, low emotion situations called OTAs and the offseason.
Let me add one more thing to this, okay? So, Booger, you played, and when you were home in Tampa working out at your gym or going to the club, whatever you did, if you got injured, that injury prevented you from earning a salary because it was called a non-football related injury. It didn't happen in the facility. So now you could have lost your entire salary. We know last year, Najee Hines, the running back who got hurt in the offseason, he lost his entire salary, okay? So if you put this in place, how many guys are going to get hurt in the offseason program doing something, whether they tear a tricep, bicep, or whatever? They're going to lose salary. Where if they do it in the facility, they got to get paid. It's a football injury. So it doesn't protect the players. Again, it goes back to your point. They want free time, but they don't think of the consequences of the free time. I think this has zero, from people I've talked to in the league, it has zero chance from the players to get past. I just don't understand why we're going to make the offseason longer when we know we're going to 18 games and we're going to eliminate a preseason game. So like you said, what are we going to do? Go to Dairy Queen every afternoon?
Here's the thing, Michael. You bring up the 18 games. Here's the only way this may pass. Roger Goodell is hell-bent on getting 18 games. And I think if you're in ownership and a decision, and I'm not saying it's going to come down to this, but let's just play this out. Let's just say behind closed doors, The players say, hey, we want no offseason. We won't show up July the 5th and start this long ramp-up period. And in exchange for that, we'll give you the 18th game. I think then the owners will sign off on it because in my mind, the only way the players should sign off on an 18th game is if they get more of the revenue. Right now, I think it's 47 to 53. It should be a 50-50 split in order to get to the 18th game, or let's come up with more insurance benefit. But I think that's going to cost the NFL owners more money. I think they will clearly bow down to this long offseason if they can get that in exchange for the 18th game. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I definitely think it's a chip. I definitely think it's a chip in the 18 games. I clearly think that. And the owners could care less about offseason. Frankly, they would rather have no offseason. The owners feel like it's the coach's job to make it work. Screw them. If they got to figure it out, we pay them enough money, we got to make it work. And they know the players are tantalized by less work. So if they get 18 games, I think it's a no-brainer. This is the chip they're going to throw to them. I think it's clearly the case. I agree completely. And I think a lot of this was floated out there for the 18 games because the players have to vote for this. They're going to have to vote for the 18 games. And there's nothing done by the NFL that gets leaked that isn't a reason for the leak. It isn't just, oh, my God, we let that out. Oh, we didn't mean to do that. It was a trial balloon. Now, it's coming down badly, but there's a trial balloon here. So I don't see it. I think of this. To me, you want to go to – if I were the president of the NFLPA, I would tell Goodell, you want to go to 18 games? Great. Okay, here's the deal. Whatever the number count for Anthony McFarland is when he played at Tampa – in 16 games during a healthy season, how many plays he played, let's say he played 1,000, then that's the limit when he goes to 18. He can't play more than 1,000. And then now the coaches have to rotate you through. And really, when you break it down, you may miss 8, 9, 10 plays a game. But it helps develop young players. It forces the coaches to play other guys. And it allows the players for health to stay healthier. They're playing a 16-game play count. Because that's really what matters is the play count, not the games. It's the play count as opposed to the number of games. And now everybody gets a benefit. And who gets screwed? The coaches, because they got to figure out, okay, I'm going to have to take the guard out here for 8 plays and move the other guard and do that. But that develops talent. It develops players.
But they didn't do that, Mike, for 17 games, so I don't think they're going to do it for 18. I think what they're going to do is realize that the big –
they'll dismiss it. Like – every idea I come up with, they dismiss. I've been pushing for having a leadership clinic for minorities and just basically spending time teaching young coaches how to become leaders. I've given my book to Troy. It all gets thrown out the tank. So I don't complain about it. Let's go back to football. I want to talk to you about the Chiefs. After Christmas Day, we thought the Chiefs were toast. We all did, right? I mean, somebody in the league sent me a text and said they're one and done. And then they go and win 4 straight. Do you think they can win 3 in a row?
Well, I think I'd be a fool to say no. Here's the thing I'll say is that the more they win, the more complacency has an opportunity to creep in. And I think the people at the top are going to try their hardest not for it to happen. And that's Andy Reid, that's Mahomes, that's Kelsey, that's Chris Jones. But because the league now is so young, because this league is because teams are given advantages for having younger players, teams are younger. And so now you're going to have all these young players buy in. We've already seen both 2 of their tackles got arrested for marijuana possession, regardless of whether you think that's a big deal or not, it happened. Rasheed Rice has had 2 run-ins with the law. Harrison Butker. Like the list of off-season discretions for the younger players are starting to mount up. And what that means is we're not paying attention to detail. We're just saying, you know what, we're high and mighty, we're the Chiefs. We can kind of do what we want to do. And as long as that happens, it's going to be tougher and tougher. But here's the key. Here's what this comes down to. Is there a team when we get into December or January that you trust more than the best offensive player, Mahomes, the best defensive player, Chris Jones, and the head coach? Because we always talk about the head, like the triumvirate of GM, head coach, quarterback. Well, that's one thing in the offseason. But let's look at on the field. On the field, head coach, best offensive player, best defensive player. It's hard to find a team with 3 better people in those positions than Andy Reid, Mahomes, and Chris Jones. And until you find one that shows up and plays in December, I'm not going to bet against them three-peating.
Yeah, it's never been done.
Point.
It's never been done before, but if anybody can do it, maybe it's the Kansas City Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid as the head coach and, of course, Chris Jones. Real quick, Booger, we got a couple minutes left before we get you out of here. I did want to ask you, since you cover both college football and the NFL, and we've talked about this on the podcast, especially immediately after the draft, the changing landscape of college football and the NIL, and now if universities can pay the student athletes and all that, how do you think that affects the NFL draft moving forward? Are we going to see more older players entering, players staying behind in college just because you can now profit in college football with NIL, or if the schools end up paying these kids?
I think the guys that are supremely talented are going to still come to the NFL draft. Remember the rumor that Marvin Harrison Jr. was going to stay at Ohio State for $20 million? He wasn't going to do that. He was going to the NFL. I think what you're going to wind up getting is the less talented or marginally talented players are going back to college. Prime example, the quarterback for Oregon, Dylan Gabriel. He could have came out, went back to Oregon. I don't think he's going to be a high draft pick anyway. I don't know if he's an NFL player, but that's an example of a guy who had, I'm sure he's got NFL aspirations. He chose to go back to school rather than come to the NFL. I think it's going to make the job easier for talent evaluators in the National Football League, because the guys that are coming out are going to be the best of the best from a talent standpoint, and you're not going to have to differentiate between the guys that are marginal. And don't get me wrong, there's still going to be marginal guys every year, but it's going to make the job a little bit easier for talent evaluators.
Yeah, no question. Like Dylan Gabriel's worth way more to Oregon's, their program, than he would be if he came out and was a fifth or sixth rounder. He's better off going back. I agree. Yeah. Before we let you go, what college football team are you excited to watch this year that that's under the radar?
Wow. Oregon would be one. I love Dan Lanning. I think he is a young leader of men. And as far as being able to watch, I don't know if they're going to be any good, but you got to love watching Colorado, man. Like Deion, he's done it his way. He's got Shedeur. He thinks Shedeur is going to be a top 5 pick. I don't know. I haven't looked at any of the quarterback film, starting to break these guys down. But Colorado is going to be a lightning rod to watch every single week, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, I mean, what they've been doing in the recruiting, it sounds like they've gotten some high-end guys, but maybe some of the depth has left Colorado. It's going to be a fascinating story in college football, just like it was to start this past season. Booger, we appreciate you hopping on with us in the GM Shuffle, man. Be well throughout the offseason. This is a real treat for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you,
hey,
my
man. Glad to be here.
Best.
I know you've been watching The Sopranos. I'm going to give you another show to watch, Femi. Watch The Mayor of Kingstown on Prime Video and get back to it.
I'm on it.
Excellent.
I'm on it.
We're getting football analysis and
on it.
TV recommendations from the one and only Booger McFarland. Subscribe, rate, and review as always. We'll see you guys later on this week.